Here back with another reaction video, this time reacting to Battle of New Orleans 1815, War of 1812 documentary by Kings and Generals. Now, the War of 1812 is something I've been meaning to react to for quite a while, and so I just I wasn't sure. There's a few videos on it over YouTube, but I wasn't sure which one to pick. So I found one based on a channel that I know has brilliant historical content. So, and I thought this might be my best bet. I went with a video done by Kings and Generals. So what little I know about the War of 1812, because it's not really taught or talked about. Well, it probably is on a rare occasion, but because the War of 1812 happened during the Napoleonic Wars in Europe, it wasn't going to be a much talked about subject. It's only most known in American or Canadian history. So what little I know about the War of 1812, it's basically when the United States decided to declare war against Britain. I believe it's something to do when the British Royal Navy was caught blockading French ports and seizing goods from neutral ships, including American ones, and also they tried to take Canada, which at the time was still a British colony, if I remember rightly, and that's little I know about it. So the usual disclaimer when I react to any historical content: if I don't show much of what is considered a proper reaction, it's probably obvious that I don't know much on the subject at hand, and I'm also maybe trying to take in new information. And if I do know anything or have any useful input, I'll most likely pause the video and give my input or ask curious questions, which hopefully will be answered down below. So without further ado, the link to the original video will be in the description down below. Please go and subscribe to Kings and Generals and check out their content, and please support their channel as best you can. So without rambling on too long, let's get this up on screen and let's get into this. As I said, I've been meaning to react to something like this for quite a while. Excuse me. Sorry, I don't know if I've said it, but this anything based on the War of 1812 I've been meaning to react to since I finished reacting to Epic History TV's Napoleonic War series. So, and I regret shelving this sort of thing for a while. So okay, let's get back into it.
Historians often view the War of 1812 as just one theatre of the larger Napoleonic Wars. It stands alone as a conflict in both American and Canadian history. Its most famous battle, the Battle of New Orleans, was also its last, and featured one of the most important American military leaders, Andrew Jackson, who led an outnumbered
Oh yeah, another thing that I know about this, of the little knowledge that I know about this, is there was no real winner. It was a officially it ended as a stalemate.
Disciplined ragtag force against
Excuse
the
me.
world's strongest military. Having been at war with Napoleonic France for a long time, Britain started pressing American merchant sailors into service, forcing them to join the Royal Navy.
Wow.
The burgeoning United States considered this illegal and threatened to retaliate, but as Britain needed these sailors to reinforce a blockade of France, the practice continued. Both that and the blockade of France had a negative effect on the American economy. Meanwhile, as the Americans expanded westward, they faced Native American nations who fought back to defend their land. the British became allies to these Native American nations, seeing them as a buffer to its Canadian colonies, and provided them with weapons. As attacks on American settlers on the frontier increased, more and more of them began to blame Britain.
Wow.
American warhawks proclaimed the need for the new country to defend its national honour. On June 4th, 1812, Congress declared war on Britain, and despite the fact many New England representatives strongly opposed the war, on June 18th, President Madison signed the declaration. Britain was caught off guard by this, as their forces in Canada were not prepared, and the country was mostly preoccupied.
I will probably say, being preoccupied with the wars across Europe, fighting Napoleonic France, well, bearing in mind that when it comes to the British military at the time, the Navy, Britain focused more on its Navy than its Army, even though the Army was formidable in its own right, but at the time, Britain still had the most powerful Navy in the world, officially.
Occupied with the war in France.
Yeah.
Luckily for the British, the American forces were not prepared either. In 1812, the United States had an army of less than 12,000.
Yeah, as I said, this is way after the, if I remember rightly, this is way after the America's independence from Britain. Sorry about that, dry throat. So, bearing in mind, this America's army now was more, a little bit more disciplined, thanks to having training by French ambassadors, and also fighting along French troops in their War of Independence. Because I mean, it was a smart thing for the Americans, or the colonists at the time. Well, I'll just say Americans. It was smart for the Americans, find an ally that dislikes Britain, and I think they found a few: the French, the Spanish, and the Dutch. I think it was the Dutch. But anyway,
1,000 soldiers. While Congress had approved the expansion of the army up to 35,000, service was voluntary, the pay was little, the army had few experienced officers, and many did not want to join because they didn't support the war.
Wow.
Still, they were the first to attack, assuming Canada would go down without much of a fight. Michigan's territorial governor, William Hull, led American forces into Canada, but mostly fought with words rather than artillery, threatening the locals with a proclamation that stated that they must surrender or the horrors and calamities of war will stalk before you. However, on August 16th, British and native forces led by Isaac Brock and Chief Tecumseh of the Shawnee Confederation attacked Hull's forces at Detroit, forcing him to surrender without firing a shot.
Wow.
The War of 1812 took place in 3 theatres: the Great Lakes region, along the East Coast, and in the South. The American...
So, I'm probably if I sound dumb, but so this is what they would call the Great Lakes region, I presume. As I said, my geography around the Americas is not great. And, because I do, as I said, I know they tried to take Canada, which is, as you can obviously see, was still a British colony at the time.
Found little success in all 3 theatres. In the Great Lakes region, after Hull's embarrassing defeat, his replacement, William Henry Harrison, struggled to defend the few frontier outposts constantly under threat from both Native American and British forces. On the northeastern border with Canada, American General Henry Dearborn struggled to prepare an attack on Montreal due to the New England militias not wanting to fight in the war. Whenever American forces did cross the border, they were often pushed back. Dearborn was replaced with Generals James Wilkinson and Wade Hampton, but their complicated invasion plan of Montreal completely fell apart in November 1813. Out west, though, American luck had begun to change, as General Oliver Hazard Perry was able to capture Lake Erie in the Battle of Put-in Bay, fought on September 10th, 1813. This paved the way for General Harrison to take back control of Detroit, defeating Major General Henry Proctor and his British and Native American forces at the Battle of the Thames on October 5th, 1813. Tecumseh was killed during the battle, and it completely demoralized his Shawnee Confederation.
Wow.
In the South, influenced by the resistance of Tecumseh and his Confederation.
I apologize if I offend anyone saying this, but I think, even though I remember this theatre or war being a stalemate, but I think the real losers were the Native Americans. And I think the real winners were the Canadians, not the British. Because I know the war between the Brits and the British and the Americans ended in a stalemate.
Native American forces continued to build up, uniting to fight the American forces. The main conflict became known as the Creek War, led by a traditionalist faction of the Creek Nation, known as the Red Sticks. Ultimately, American forces led by General Andrew Jackson defeated the Red Sticks at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in present-day Alabama on March 27, 1814. This ended the Creek War. Meanwhile, along the East Coast, the British Royal Navy was dominating. Throughout the war, they had set up a blockade from Maine all the way down to Georgia. In April 1814, after Napoleon went into exile, Britain was able to focus more on defeating the Americans, sending thousands more troops to North America. British forces led by Major General Robert Ross took over Chesapeake Bay and took the US capital, Washington, on August 24, 1814, famously burning government buildings like the Capitol and the President's home to the ground. As Americans fled the capital, troops gathered at...
I have heard that mentioned that the British forces at the time burned down the White House, and that's the only time, as far as I'm aware, the only time that the White House was ever attacked and destroyed. It still surprised me that the British forces at the time managed to burn down the presidential building of the American capital.
At nearby Fort McHenry.
Sorry if that was a bit redundant the way I said that.
Against any further British advances. During the Battle of Baltimore in September 1814, American forces held back both sea and land invasions by the British, killing Major General Ross in the process. This resistance eventually inspired Francis Scott Key to create a poem which later became the lyrics for the Star-Spangled Banner, the national anthem of the United States.
Please, YouTube, please don't copyright me.
Negotiations were already underway in the city of Ghent in modern-day Belgium. On Christmas Eve, 1814, a deal was struck to end the war. However, the news of that would not reach America until a few weeks later, and British forces were well on their way to the city of New Orleans, a strategically important port city located where the Mississippi River meets the Gulf of Mexico. Capturing it would have allowed them to take over the Louisiana Territory. Britain had sent 60 ships, with approximately 14,450 soldiers and sailors aboard, all under the command of Admiral Sir Alex Cochrane. On the other side was Andrew Jackson, who by this time had become one of the most successful, if not the most successful, American leaders of the war. When he had first arrived to New Orleans, he found the city...
Like I said, with any nation, all it takes is that one commander to change things.
city completely defenseless. He immediately
Wow.
declared martial law and collected civilians to garrison the outskirts of the city. The army he built was mostly made up of untrained militiamen and volunteers. It was a ragtag bunch which included free blacks, New Orleans aristocrats, and members of the native Choctaw Nation. His troops were so diverse that orders had to be given in English, French, Spanish, and Choctaw.
Wow.
The night before the peace treaty was signed, Jackson led his 2,131 men in a surprise attack on the British camp 9 miles south of New Orleans. The completely unwitting British troops managed to fight off Jackson's forces, but 46 of their soldiers were killed, with 167 wounded and 64 missing. Jackson's attack had shocked them. They expected a quick victory with their superior, experienced forces, but everything looked more complicated now. The British responded with a sortie on December 28th and an artillery bombardment on New Year's Day. Both failed due to successful American counterfire. By the early days of January, reinforcements had arrived for both sides, with the British soldiers now over 8,000 strong and Jackson's troops numbering 4,732. Jackson's men built up fortifications near the Rodriguez Canal, which branched off the Mississippi River and was about 5 miles south of New Orleans. Jackson used slaves to widen the canal into a defensive trench, and used the extra dirt to build a 7-foot-tall rampart supported by timber. This barrier, nicknamed Line Jackson, stretched from the Mississippi to the marsh, which was next to impossible to get through. Jackson told his soldiers, "Here we shall plant our stakes, and not abandon them until we drive these redcoat rascals into the river or the swamp." Despite the imposing fortifications, the confident British Lieutenant General Edward Pakenham planned a 2-part frontal attack.
Wait, did he just say Edward Pakenham? Isn't that the Duke... Correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't that the Duke of Wellington's brother-in-law?
The first part involved a small British force crossing the west bank of the Mississippi and taking over an American battery. After getting those guns, the plan was to turn them on the Americans, catching the defenders in a barrage of crossfire. The second part involved a force of 5,000 men charging forward in 2 columns to overwhelm the main American line at the Rodriguez Canal. Seeing heavy fog on the morning of January 8th, Pakenham decided that this was the day to execute his plan just before dawn. His main force charged towards the canal near the swamp. They were met by shots from Jackson's 24 cannons. Along the riverbank, Colonel Robert Rennie advanced his forces, dominating an American redoubt. But before Rennie could claim victory, however, he was shot dead, and his men frantically retreated. Unluckily for the British, the fog quickly lifted, giving American gunners clear sight of the enemy forces. Cannon fire successfully split the British line in several places. Jackson's soldiers, many of them hunters of the frontier, fired with flying precision. Pakenham, who was up front with his forces, was a victim of that accuracy. He was hit and died minutes later. The lead British commander on the battlefield was now gone as well. Meanwhile, the British force that was supposed to take over the American battery was delayed. They captured it and were modestly successful at taking out some American troops, but by that time it was too late. At Line Jackson, the British soldiers were retreating in huge numbers. The British attack on Jackson's fortification was a failure, and they had lost around 2,000 men, including 3 generals and 7 colonels. The whole battle lasted less than 30 minutes. Jackson's underdog unit lost less than 70 men. The British Army remained in Louisiana for several days. After its naval force failed to take Fort St. Philip on January 18th, the British had to retreat back to the Gulf of Mexico. Soon, both sides had finally received the message that a peace treaty had already been signed. The Battle of New Orleans was the final major battle of the War of 1812, and is often considered the most important battle of the war, despite being fought after a peace treaty was negotiated. The battle was significant for the Americans, as they were huge underdogs in Louisiana and expected the worst. This victory raised the profile of Andrew Jackson, who was now a national hero. And while most historians conclude today that the War of 1812 was a stalemate, it felt like a victory to Americans after the victory at New Orleans. We are planning more videos on US and Canadian history, so make sure that you are subscribed to our channel and have pressed the bell button to be notified.
And that'll do it. This has been an interesting insight into the War of 1812. And yeah, so that was an interesting video. As I said, these American, as I said, I didn't know how diverse Jackson's army was, but I was surprised to hear the name Edward Pakenham. As I said, because this the War of 1812 is not really talked about a lot in Britain. I didn't know much, as you can tell by my lack of reacting, that I didn't know much about the War of 1812. As I said, I think I like to think it was a stalemate for the Americans and the British, but I think if you have to say there was a winner, I think it was technically the Canadians that were. I'm probably going to offend people, but I think the real winners were the Canadians, and the losers, unfortunately, I think were the Native Americans. But that's just how I see it. Each view is different. So yeah, this has been an interesting video. If you like this reaction, please like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you